See all the faces.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you guys are connecting and really cultivating, thinking about diving into this concept. What are the key things you want to get out of tonight's session?
Yeah.
So I am going to be sharing my screen, but before I do introduce myself, Christopher Bennett, I'm also part of Black Achievers on the executive committee, and we have something special in store for you tonight. So let me go ahead and share the screen. All right. So what we're going to go through right now is going to be basically a broad-based process in terms of how to acquire a business. General things for you to think of. Now, the intent is not to give you a boilerplate, step-by-step checklist, but to give some context, some validation for us all in terms of thinking about how the Minority Business Accelerator can assist and help and understanding the overall process. So the intent of this first leg of the presentation is going to be just getting us grounded in the business buying process. As shared at the beginning of the call, please, please, please send us your questions in the chat. We want to make sure we capture them all. We're going to allow for our team from the Minority Business Accelerator to get through the presentation. We're going to get through the initial portion of our keynote, and then we're going to dive right in. And we're going to tackle this thing from left, right, and center. So in getting us started, 8 steps to the business buying process. As we've shared multiple times, the primary purpose, if you had to tell someone about what Black Achievers is and what they're trying to do, we're trying to connect, empower, and build Black people. So in the process of economically empowering, we see business acquisition as a serious wealth-building tool that many of us have primarily been exposed to in terms of building a business, but not necessarily in terms of buying a business. And when I say buying a business, acquiring something that can be netting anywhere north of $1 million in revenue. So we're going to anchor our presentation there. Before we start in step 1, I'm going to invite 2 members of the Minority Business Accelerator team to first introduce themselves, and they're going to take us through the 8 steps of broadly buying a business. So I'm going to turn it over to one of them.
Yeah, so I'll start. My name is Micah Dixon. I'm a senior business advisor at the Minority Business Accelerator. My background is in corporate finance and business banking. I saw some familiar Fifth Third faces. So that's where I'm alumni from. And my role at the Accelerator is really to help with these M&A deals. So help entrepreneurs figure out a strategy, help them find a company, and help them get the deal done.
Thanks, Micah. Good evening. I'm Robert Lamoth. I'm with the Minority Business Accelerator for my second tour, I call it. And I, like Micah and a lot of folks on here, have spent time at Fifth Third. So I have a banking and investment banking background. So yeah, my primary goal is to identify those targets in the marketplace that are in play for some kind of transitional activity. So yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start with some of these slides. So our goal really is to really give a quick overview because we want to leave as much time as possible for question and answer. You probably came with questions to this session, so we want to make sure that we can answer as many as possible. So we're going to start with these steps, and then we'll get into a little bit about the fund, and then go into Q&A. So first off, step 1 is deciding what business you want to buy. And I would say this is probably the most critical step because it'll make all the other steps easier. The example here has business to business and the revenue and the number of employees and the location. You need to think through all of these steps, right? What is the industry you want to target? It doesn't have to be business to business. That's just something that we at the Accelerator specialize in and really focus on. But it could be business to consumer. The revenue size, the number of employees, location, but more importantly, what are your skill sets? What are you good at? What are your strengths and your weaknesses? And what needs to be in the organization to help you leverage your strengths and then can supplement some of those weaknesses that you have. So you really need to think through that, and that'll make step 2, if you can go to the next slide, a lot easier. So step 2 is finding a business, and that's going to all of these deal sources. So you have, we help to source finding businesses that are for sale, online brokers, There are local business brokers, attorneys, CPAs, bankers. I'll tell you probably the most effective way to find a business is to just pick up the phone and call business owners. Simple as that, cold calling, right? The reason why I said step one is so important is defining what kind of business you're looking for, is because then you can go to all of these sources and tell a pretty consistent story. Is I'm looking for a business that's this size with this many employees, that has this type of culture. That will help all these deal sources. When they come across something, you'll be the first one they think about, right? And that's kind of the position you want to be in, is that if somebody comes across something that fits your exact profile, they can send it to you. Next slide, please. Step three is valuing the business. So after you identify a business, what's probably going to happen is you're going to go and sign a non-disclosure agreement. And they'll give you a ton of information, kind of preliminary information about the business. And a big piece of that are going to be the financials. So there are different methods to valuing a business, but they all include a combination of the assets of the business, what are the revenues, the net business income, and then EBITDA, so earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. There's also probably going to be a portion where they add in kind of the owner's salary and some of the benefits. But based on those numbers, you'll come to a valuation of the business. So how much the business is worth. Next slide, please. So then you're going to start negotiating a purchase price. So you're going to go through this valuation, and you're really going to say, this is how much I want to pay. I'll be willing to pay for the business, right? Now, this is not a set in stone thing. Once you put this offer out there, that does not mean that it's going to necessarily stay there once we get into the later steps. But what you're saying is, based on the information I have currently, this is how much I think the business is worth. And there's probably going to be some negotiation back and forth. The seller's probably going to have a higher number in their head. You're probably going to have a lower number, and you'll come to a price that everybody feels good about moving forward on. Next slide, please. So this is submitting the letter of intent. So once you've kind of come to an agreement on the price, you want to try to get this letter of intent signed by the seller. What this does, it lays out kind of the basic structure of the deal. So the price, how you're going to be paying for it, what combination of kind of bank debt, your personal investment from others, and then also if the seller is going to carry a seller's note or some portion of seller's debt. But the most important thing is this gives you the exclusive right to purchase the business. So as long as this thing is in place, and usually they last for between 60 to 90 days, for those 69 days, they can't go shopping this around to others, right? They are contractually obligated to give you the right of first refusal. In other words, the only person who can purchase it during that time period is going to be you. Next slide, please. And then there's going to be completing due diligence. So after you get the LOI signed, that's when the clock starts ticking. And at this point, you want to gather as much information about the business as possible. So you want to look at all the financials, contracts, who's on the payroll, who their customers are, information about marketing. I mean, everything about this business, all the legal documents, everything about the business, you want to have really start to examine to make sure there's nothing hidden in there, right? You want to make sure that what they were selling you on before the LOI is still true. You're going to find some good things and you're going to find some negatives. And that's why when I said the purchase price is going to be kind of fluid, you're going to find some things that might bring down that purchase price as you go through the information. And then I think, Robert, you're going to be taking this next slide forward.
I will, thanks. So as Micah indicated, so all the things he was talking about are things that happened before, you arrive at this price. Now, this is the payoff slide. Like, this is how we pay for it, right? Everybody's talking, we're having conversation, shaking hands, we have agreements, but we have a need for external capital. So that will primarily always exist unless you bring in 100% of that money to the table. We are going to have a reliance on external financing that we're going to need. So And to tell you the truth, this is where the breakdown happens, right? There, you're kind of unilaterally talking to the seller, and you guys are all on the same page, and then all of a sudden now you're bringing in some third party to look at this thing, and so they sort of re-review it, right? Everything that you've talked about, all that due diligence pretty much gets done because you've introduced a new partner in this discussion. And so this slide really just represents that there's multiple ways to obtain the capital. So SBA loans, bank loans, royalty financing is just sort of it's like an earn out through the profits that could pay off any capital that was secured on the front end. And then for those that are transitioning out of a corporate environment or anything where you would have a retirement account, there is the ability to securitize your new business and actually buy stock in your business through some of your retirement funds. So this really slide just represents there's multiple ways to get at capital. So next slide, Chris. And then, once we've sort of, we've got comfort with the external partners, the capital is raised. Now we just really get into a lot of the legalities and things of transitioning a business entity, because these are, the transactions that we're talking about are established businesses who have a track record and a going concern. So this just sort of walks you through some steps. And the important part to remember here is you always have advocates, the MBA and others, who are going to guide you through this process. So I think that's important as we look at all these slides. So next slide. And again, so how does the money work? How do we pay for this business? Sort of what I touched on a little bit. And then how do you make money? After you've went out and you've gotten this capital and you've done all these things, you've negotiated the selling price, you've done all these things. Now here you are as the business owner. So we'll kind of hit on just a couple of those. So next slide. And this is just sort of an example of a transaction. This is what we call a capital stack. And, there's money coming in from different external financiers. That top line is going to be your bank financing. It could be SBA or conventional. It's basically just think of that as your bank financing, the seller. So your seller in our negotiations, whatever price point you come to, that might be a little over and above what like Mike had mentioned, the assets plus whatever the cash flow number would come to. The seller they may not agree to that. So, but they could hold, they could take some seller financing. So they hold a note that sort of gets paid alongside or after some of the bank financing is retired. And then you're always going to be obligated for some kind of equity injection. And that ties you to the business, ties you to the transaction, and lets everybody know at the table that you're vested in this as well. Now that question about what if you don't have the 10% to invest, there's obviously on that other slide we could talk about various ways, but there is going to be an equity requirement. So, but again, know that you've got advocates and partners that can help with that discussion. And then, and so that last one really just talks about the Minority Business Accelerator. So next slide. And so, this slide, when I looked at this slide, the primary thing that we're taking away from this is, we wanted to dispel this rumor of when I buy a business, I'm going to be eating ramen noodles and I'm not going to be able to get a salary. It's a misnomer, right? The businesses that we're going to be looking at are well established, have an established cash flow. If anything, what we see is the current owners of the business are actually extracting probably an exorbitant amount of salaries, and we can actually step back to a salary that would, be more than meet your needs and reduce the overall cost structure for that business. And so, I just kind of wanted to dispel that, because that's not how business works. That's not how entrepreneurship works, where you don't get paid and you figure out how to make your bills. That's not how this formula works. And so, and then the next one is, obviously we have full exposure to all the profits. And, if you were to sell the business, you get the profits as well. So next slide. And again, so this really just reinforces that fact that you have advocates and folks, in our position at the MBA, and we guide through this entire process, right? And it's not linear. So you're going to have things that, we're going to have progress, and then we'll have a back step in progress. And so we just know all the time that you've got advocates in that arena that are versed in this process and will lead you through it. We really need your desire and your passion about owning businesses. If we have that, then we can make this other stuff work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren Reedus. He'll kind of talk to you about an equity fund as we talk about ways to get capital. This is a very innovative way that, locally, we are able to starting to amass capital to invest in these businesses. So Darren.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thrilled to, I guess, rejoin. We had, for those that we had a chance to sort of meet recently via a prior call leading up to this one. For those that we did not have a chance to connect in that initial session, again, my name is Darren Reedus. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Cincinnati, USA Regional Chamber, and also Executive Director of the Minority Business Accelerator, which is now in its 17th year. Created, for those that may not be aware, out of Cincinnati's civil unrest back in 2001. This was one of the primary sort of efforts officially launched in 2003, trying to in some way address economic disparities with a particular focus on scaling up, actually specifically African-American businesses. Hispanic business community was added to this initiative some years later. The initiative then and today has been focused on connecting more high growth potential companies to the supply chains of our corporate partners. And so because of that, so the P&Gs and Fifth Thirds and many others. And so because of that supply chain focus, the accelerator from inception to today has been focused on businesses with at least $1 million in annual revenues, and the B2B, or as was mentioned, business to business, or B2G, business to government business model. We have over the 17 years now serviced about 70 companies, many of which we're still actively engaged with. This was actually a quote unquote accelerator before there were accelerators. The proliferation of accelerators and such across the country that we now see as cohorts that go through training for some period of time and get graduated. We really don't graduate anyone. We still work with companies in certain cases from day one. The needs, of course, change, but the average size of the minority firms we work with today is about 30 million in terms of average size. And so I was brought in about 5 years ago now, relocating here from Cleveland. For those that's perhaps problematic, don't hold Cleveland against me. And so it's been a good run. I was in part charged to help take this work to the next level. And I'll very quickly just define what that is, and then I'll get into the fund. The next level for us basically is, when I came on board, we had an aggregation of minority firms that, if you add up their annual revenues across the board, they did about $1 billion or so in annual revenues as a group, created about 3,500 jobs as a group. And we wanted to double those two numbers. So growing by an incremental billion and creating another 3,000 or so jobs in a 5 to 7 year sort of window. To get there, we have created 4 fundamental pillars of work that'll tie into the fund that I'll talk about in a second. Our 4 pillars of work, and again, this might be repetitive for some, but I think the more you hear it, the better. Our 4 pillars are what we call grow, build, attract, and create. The grow pillar fundamentally just means let's grow the current companies that we work with to their next level. So if they're already at $1 million, how to go from $1 million to 2. If they're already at 10, how to go from 10 million to 20. If they're already at 20, 20 to 50, et cetera. So there's always another level, which is why, again, we really don't graduate companies. Every year there's another game plan. How do we take it to the next level? that's sort of the fundamental historical work in the grow pillar that's just perpetuated. Our build pillar is building a pipeline of emerging minority firms. So these are companies under $1 million, but we believe have high growth potential. And we work in conjunction with a bunch of other nonprofits in town to help make that process come to life. I would say, in short, what happens in this build pipeline, for those that have any sort of connectivity to the tech world or have even just heard of pitch nights and all that sort of thing, well, an entrepreneur just doesn't show up on that pitch night automatically ready to present. A lot of work goes into wrapping a set of services around that entrepreneur to understand their value proposition, understand their market segmentation, competitive analysis, financials, et cetera, et cetera. The problem often is if you don't have a sexy tech company, you don't benefit from that kind of comprehensive wraparound assistance. So we bring that very same wraparound assistance to high growth, not necessarily high tech companies in our build pillar. And our attract pillar is working with an organization in town called Ready Cincinnati, trying to attract large minority companies in the region where we don't have them. This is all about gaps. If we don't have it in our portfolio, if it's not in the pipeline, can we perhaps attract that kind of company to the region? And then finally, specific to this conversation, is our create pillar. How do we create minority firms through the acquisition of mainstream or non-minority firms, if you will, with no succession plan, no kids in the company interested in taking it over? How can we arm and prepare through sessions like this and many others, people of color to acquire existing companies that are already in the market? We don't always have to grow something from the ground up. And so depending on the report that one reads, there are literally trillions of dollars in play across the country in small to mid-cap companies. Small to mid-cap meaning a couple million in sales to 25, 50 million in sales, that again are aging, predominantly white business owners. Kids have gone on to do something entirely different. They don't want to run that metal stamping company or forging plant or whatever it may be, and there's no succession plan. I don't have to lecture this group about the realities of industries like manufacturing. Think about your typical image of a manufacturing plant and heavy equipment and big machinery, and it's very capital intensive. So if you take a capital intensive industry like manufacturing, overlaid against historical lack of access to capital for people of color, of course, you're not going to see a lot of minority-owned manufacturing firms in today's landscape nationally. But what a great opportunity to acquire in to those industries now that, again, those owners are aging out. And again, kids are going to do something entirely different. And so it's a huge opportunity to create a business, if you will, that you pick up on the existing customer base, a lot of things we can get into, but to buy something that's already well established. And then there's another piece to this that is really getting our banking partners, accounting firm partners, and law firm partners super excited to partner with us. And that's this. More than ever, especially in response to the national unrest last year, you see more corporations, and of course some more serious than others, looking to really double down on their own commitments to minority business, inclusion efforts, et cetera. And a part of that is doing more business with minority firms. But here's the reality that doesn't get talked about all that often. If you're going to do business with a large corporation, that's typically not for startups. That's typically requires capacity, that requires scale, that requires infrastructure. And so because there are simply gaps in the supply chain, and we just don't have sufficient numbers of minority businesses at size, those same gaps that we get from our corporate partners can inform the hunt for businesses to acquire. So if we get, for example, our corporate partners saying we don't have, anywhere near the number of minority-owned, let's say, stamping plants or metal forging, whatever it may be, those gaps we then share with our banking partners, our law firm partners, our accounting firm partners, because it's their customers. It's their customers that are the same small to mid-cap companies without succession plans. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me talk really quickly about the fund. I talked about these 4 pillars of work that are the core of the accelerator. And our fund will invest across all 4. The primary purpose of today is talking about pillar 4, this create pillar, or acquisitions. And so we're creating a $100 million fund. This is designed also to be what's called a CDFI, which stands for Community Development Financial Institution. And what that basically just means, it's a special designation from the U.S. Treasury's office that signifies basically impact investing. It signifies community focus. It signifies the type of investments that our banking partners, if they invest in us, they get Community Reinvestment Act credit. And it's one of those special designations that signifies community impact. And so we will be set up as a CDFI. Of this $100 million, we've already soft circled, which means we have verbal commitments of about 50 of that 100 million. The difference between the verbal commitments and firm commitments is basically us ourselves going through the due diligence process of the folks investing in us. And so the various banks and others looking to invest in our fund are asking us a bunch of questions about our investment thesis, our team, our backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. But we feel fantastic about not only converting those soft commitments to firm commitments, but also getting to this $100 million goal. Most likely from a timing standpoint, we'll be able to officially launch the fund, meaning we're actually open to start doing deals, most likely by the end of April, first part of May. Having said that, we're actually in working with organizations like Black Achievers, quietly sort of behind the scenes, looking at some transactions even today, so that when we officially launch that fund, we can also perhaps announce our first 1 or 2 investments at the same time. And so that activity is underway. The fund will invest both straight equity capital, which means we're just another partner bringing money to the table, or we can also invest what we call equity-like capital, which is just flexible debt where we take no ownership in the business whatsoever, but we're trying to help with some of that capital stack that Micah and Robert mentioned. And for the sake of clarification, I want to reiterate some of that because these are things that you'll need to hear several times before it starts to sink in. I want to try to also help demystify this. One, on buying a business, and I too, not fifth third in this case, but I too have come from the banking environment. The first 17 years of my career in Cleveland was Nat City and Key Bank. And so, I've been doing deals for lots of years as well. And in that life, quite frankly, have financed deals with all sorts of structures. But the standard structure is that seller who agrees to take some portion of that purchase price over time, which is just referred to as a seller note. So they, in fact, become part of the financing because they're literally financing part of that purchase. They don't need it all day one. So they're willing to be paid out essentially monthly payments, quarterly payments, what have you, over a period of time. Depending on the right situation and the right owner, I have seen businesses purchase with entirely seller financing because the seller did not need that cash right away. They were well set in terms of where they were in their life. And that buyer was able to buy that business over the next 5 to 7 years, making monthly payments to that seller. And so that happens, right? I won't say that's the norm, but that certainly happens. the norm is kind of the seller takes some portion, and then there's the bank piece. The bank typically provides some additional portion. And the reason we really wanted to create our fund is where these deals typically fall apart. Like most things we have to purchase, whether it be a house or a car, what have you, there's a down payment. When you're buying a company, often that down payment, if you will, that equity check that has to be written can be large. It could be, depending on the size of the deal, a couple $100,000 or what have you. So that's the particular gap our fund is trying to fill, to make sure that we don't lose opportunities because our buyers didn't have enough cash to get that complete sort of capital stack completed. And so that said, again, these deals can take on a variety of forms and structures. We're simply giving everyone rules of thumb today. And so I also want to spend just a couple of minutes on, Micah touched on the valuation of companies. I want to try to further demystify that as well. If you're really investing in anything, right, a CD, you know, you've got some window of time where you want your money back, right? And so when you're thinking about buying a company, it's like, okay, how soon can I get back what I'm about to pay, you know, for this company, plus some meaningful return? And that typically is a 5 to 7 year horizon when you want to, you know, get that investment back plus. And so part of the valuation then is, what kind of cash flow has this business that I'm thinking of purchasing, what kind of cash flow has it been kicking off? And can it actually repay what the purchase price of this company is over the next 5 years or so, right? So that's where this whole earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation, the famous EBITDA. But to just demystify that, just the earnings, the cash flow of the company, what has that looked like over the past, you know, several years? And typically, when folks are valuing businesses, there is a rule of thumb multiple of that earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation number. So let's just say a business was generally, you know, making, let's just say, $700,000 of EBITDA a year. And so the standard sort of rule of thumb is 3 to 5 times that EBITDA number, which means, you know, either 3 times would be, you know, 2.1 million. You know, if it was 5 times, you know, you're, you know, 3.5 million, right? These are rules of thumb, right? But with the general philosophy there is, and sometimes that multiple, depending on the industry, it can be a little bit longer, but that's sort of the general sort of, you know, the processing. So then we dig into those numbers. How legitimate is that cash flow number? So we'll help you pick it apart. And Micah mentioned the due diligence that happens when these deals are on the table. We don't expect you guys to do that work alone. We have a complete due diligence checklist of all the different items that have to be reviewed to make sure that we're getting the right information. We're not, you know, getting something that's some made up figure. And so while a lot to dig into and learn, this is also a process that can easily be, if you will, demystified. So tremendous opportunity. One of our banking partners, as an example, that is looking to be an investor in our fund, has already shared with us. But Darren, we have over 100 companies in our current loan portfolio in the bank that meet this description of an aging white business owner, no kids in the company interested in taking it over, and no succession plan. So we are in the process of meeting with said bank, explaining what we're doing to the top lenders in that bank so that they can also begin to enlighten their customer base. And this is one of the keys to this enlightenment. That is a unique value proposition that the typical white seller is not hearing. I mentioned earlier that there's a commitment that we're seeing more than ever of corporations, major corporations, to do more business with women and minority firms. So let's play out a scenario. let's say there's a $10 million white-owned manufacturing firm with no succession plan. And we're able to negotiate a purchase, and that same $10 million company now becomes a minority-owned $10 million firm. Our ability to leverage that business and find customers within the supplier diversity realm, this stepped up commitment, not just of regional corporations in this region, but nationally, and literally tee up business for that company and grow it from 10 million to 20, 30, 40 million is not some far-fetched notion. And the seller, that same white seller, can ride that upside in what's called an earnout. So they can participate in some of that growth. And that is not the value proposition that they're hearing just by selling to another white buyer. And so this is where some of this education comes in, the partnering with our banks and our accounting firms and law firms. And of course, there's no guarantee to that upside, but there is certainly a reality. In fact, so much of a reality that as we have identified businesses, we can actually get the procurement people from the corporations to weigh in on how much money that corporation spends in that type of industry. We can't get some immediate commitment before that deal gets closed. We can certainly get the voice of the customer to get a good sense of how we can actually scale that business up post-acquisition. So I'm going to pause there. There's so much that we can get into, and I see there's been quite a few questions coming in here. Myself, Micah, Robert are here for the balance of the session here just to answer any questions that you guys have. And again, it ain't gonna all get done today, but this is sort of the beginning of what we hope is a fruitful, ongoing relationship. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for that, Darren, and thank you guys so much for dropping your questions in the chat. I'm going to hand it over to David to kind of start curating some of the initial questions, and we're going to take our time and work through it. What I will tell you, we have the line at 8:30. What we're going to probably do is around probably 8:20, 8:25. We'll be pointing towards wrapping up, but this is the most important part of tonight's session. So, David, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, I've listed all the questions. Let me go through them. The first one is, are you sending the PPT to participants? Oh, sorry. Please explain IRA rollover for business startups. Is this an IRS rule? And when did it go into effect? I guess it's the question. When did it go into effect?
You want to hit that one, Robert?
Yeah, I'll take it. So essentially, there's tax code where you basically create a security for your new business, and it becomes it's not a registered security like a stock or anything, but it's a privately held stock. So you basically go through this, and then your company becomes an eligible investment vehicle for your retirement funds, because the retirement funds have a very restricted use. But by securitizing this business, it becomes an eligible investment vehicle, and then you can invest your IRA monies into that. So again, that's those are remote kind of capital structures. Our preference would be, to Darren's point, I mean, those are far-reaching ones. If we don't have any other options, there's really, there is no reason to dip into that IRA. Really, we want to protect that. And any business transaction that you're in, whether it be your home or buying this business, all of your retirement money is excluded from any collateral or offset from losses or from loan losses or anything like that. So, we would structure that only in the most remote situations where we needed it, because we do want to protect that retirement money. That's not our preference. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, the next question is, would this be the same process for a franchise? So I guess, does the MBA support franchises?
Yeah, great question. We don't as a rule. And franchises are a bit of a different animal, from the standpoint of there's usually, depending on the franchisor, There's a certain set of requirements to buy into a franchise, and that's its own sort of quote unquote playbook. Everything from fast food restaurants to various other types of franchises. Usually, the franchisor basically has a set of requirements. It's somewhat similar from the standpoint that when it's time to buy in, there is some amount of capital that's required to do so, but it's a formula that each sort of franchisor sort of operates under. As a rule, we at the Accelerator don't really work with franchises. Having said that, if we have a business that let's just say we're thinking about one of our existing firms that perhaps wants to, and this hasn't happened yet, so I'm really kind of pontificating here, but if one of our businesses wanted to sort of replicate or expand in some way, we might consider some of the elements of what happens in franchising, but it's just not the core of what we do. The core of our work is really preparing companies to do business with major corporations.
Okay, thank you. The next question, can you purchase a business using a promissory note?
You can. That's kind of part of the seller's note piece of it, right? To the example that Darren used, sellers financing the entire deal is a promissory note. So yes, you can finance it that way. And quite frankly, any loan that you get, even from a bank, is technically a promissory note. So that's a main source of funding.
Okay. Next one, when you purchase a business, does the Dun & Bradstreet number registration transfer also, or do you need to register for a new one?
Yeah, so it basically would be a refresh of the D&B report. You'll still capture the history of the business and all, but it's a refresh of the D&B report.
Okay. And there's been several questions about getting a copy of the slides, the video. The recording of this presentation will be sent out to all participants, so you will have access to all the information. And then Black Achievers also has a YouTube channel where you can go and see this presentation and all previous presentations. Okay, the next question was, I think someone reached out to the MBA and they just wanted to know, essentially, how do you become a participant? What's the process? Because it seems like maybe they fell through the cracks. But what's the process to participate with the MBA?
Yeah, the basic process is that either one of our partners in the community or ourselves will identify a existing company that already is at that $1 million or better revenue level. And we, have our set of conversations, sort of jointly decide that there's the desire to scale it up much further. One of the things that we focus on as well is, let's say a company is at that $1 million threshold and they're good there, right? It creates the kind of lifestyle for them that they want, which is great. But if they're not interested in scaling further, it's really not a fit, if you will, for the core work of the Accelerator. We'll make sure that we can get them other resources that they may need to sort of maintain that. But this is really all about scaling companies up. And so we basically have a few meetings and then mutually decide together to move forward, and then think of us as a boutique consulting group. And so the process starts with a very comprehensive assessment of the business. Where are you? Where are you trying to go? How are you going to get there? Who are your key customers, et cetera, et cetera. And then that assessment leads to the development of a growth plan. And that growth plan is what guides our work together on a go-forward basis.
Okay, thank you. Can you speak about being a partial owner, about partial ownership and not an operator? Are there examples of how the MBA has helped individuals in this capacity, or do you target individuals that only are interested in being an owner operator?
So I'm happy to take that. I don't want to, dominate the answer. So if you guys want to weigh in, by all means.
Go ahead, Derek.
We're mainly focused on buyouts, right? So not necessarily having minority ownership in the business, but a complete buyout of the business. That's what our focus is.
What I'll add to that, and Mike is spot on. What I'll add to that is in the realm of acquisitions, that's spot on. But as I mentioned, we have 4 pillars of work, right? And so it is fairly common for us to come across a business that business needs more investment capital, right? And so it already has an owner operator, but it now needs a partner. It now needs some investment. And so yes, in that regard, we come across a fair number of folks, quite frankly, that could use some additional investment capital. So if there's folks that may not want to be the owner operator, but provide investment capital to an existing company, those opportunities certainly exist.